Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not going to keep it too complicated, as you can see. I'll be happy if you can remember these three questions and the answers to those. So I'm a PhD student at Colorado School of Mines. My advisor is Dr. Eggert. A lot of people might know him. And this project is part of my dissertation, and I've been working with Resources of the Future, a think tank in DC, for this. So what are we exploring here? Well, we've been talking and hearing a lot about mineral security and dangers from Chinese domination, policy risks associated with that. And my talk is primarily going to focus on what are the risks governing mineral security policy, and with a focus on critical raw materials used in electric vehicles. So the three questions I would like to touch upon today are: what raw materials are critical to electric vehicles? Why do we think their supplies might be at risk? And hence, we have this desire for mineral security. And from whatever we learn from that, we want to understand what the implications to public policy are. So starting with the first one, this is very simple to answer. A lot of you might be knowing the raw materials critical to electric vehicles. Well, electric vehicles are being considered one of the key clean energy technologies as part of the energy transition at the global level. And if you look at the critical raw materials within electric vehicles, well, the smaller ones, battery minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and graphite. And when it comes to the magnet materials, it's the rare earths, and there are several of them, four primarily: neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. And the focus of this study is largely on battery minerals, and we're using lithium and cobalt as case studies. Coming to the next question, why do we think that the supply of these minerals might be at risk? So to answer this, I'm going to segregate it into further questions. What are the risks? Do we have evidence to support these risks? And is there an alternative explanation to this whole thing? To start, looking at lithium and cobalt, we are going to look at China and the rest of the world and trying to understand where the two stand. So as far as lithium goes, China refined 65% of the global supply of lithium in 2020, which largely shows geographic concentration. China's capacity basically grew 7 times in just 7 years. So while the rest of the world wouldn't have even doubled capacity during that same period. And the processing, like I said, only by 10%, the processing capacity expanded in the rest of the world. Comparing this to cobalt, China refined 74% of cobalt supply in 2021. The refining capacity, the average annual growth rate was about 24% in just, from 99 to 21. And this same period, the rest of the world expanded capacity by less than 2%. So what is really happening? What we've been hearing, China is basically producing for the rest of for the entire world, sometimes so much so that they have gone to global overcapacity situations, so their capacities are much higher than global demand at certain points. So what is the rest of the world doing? Letting China produce for everybody? What are we doing? That's the question we need to be asking, but there are obviously reasons why this whole thing occurred. FDI movement and all the incentives, the industrial policy that China implemented that created this massive change. So in terms of risks, I'd like to talk about 2 major risks. One is quantity risk. So what do we mean by quantity risk here is, say, okay, now China is dominating production. What can China do? The biggest fear that people have is China can just stop exporting or giving these materials to the rest of the world. So that's the biggest risk that most people think about. So could China have a geopolitical war or a trade war with the US, for example, and just prevent the US from receiving these materials, or any other country, for example? The classic case would be what really happened in 2010. There was a controversy with Japan, and the consequence was that rare earth prices shot up. So this kind of a risk is what I call a quantity risk. So China could be motivated by international conflicts to restrict supplies to individual countries. So that's the first risk you're talking about. The second type could be, instead of restricting supply, what China could do is exercise market power. So what do I mean by that is it could be done in multiple ways where it comes under price risk. So the quantities they could stop producing or reduce production, and then what would happen when the demand is going up and they reduce production? Prices will skyrocket. That's exactly what happened in 2010 when they put an export ban. It didn't just affect Japan. It just made everybody speculate, oh my God, what's going to happen next, and prices skyrocketed. So China could restrict supplies to the global market as a whole, and as in this way, I mean, you can compare this to what OPEC is accused of doing several times, like reduce output, thereby increase prices for crude oil. So that's the second kind of risk that we think could happen. So the other alternative could be that China could also flood the markets with oversupply, and that could lead to reduced prices and therefore deter competitors from entering these markets. The third kind of price risk is, given that they are controlling large part of the market, they could have different pricing for domestic customers and different pricing for export buyers. So these are the kind of risks we think could happen, but what evidence do we have? And I'm looking specifically here, like I said, only to lithium and cobalt now. So did we really find any evidence of any of these kind of risks or actual implementation of these? So to restrict supply to these particular countries, China would somehow have to effectively limit the reallocation of supply across entire markets if you're talking about the quantity risk. For example, what happened, a lot of you might be aware about the antimony export ban. So if you're not aware, China implemented an export ban exclusively with the US for antimony exports, which means nobody can sell from China to the US. What really happened is in 5 months, antimony imports in the US were like so high, combined, like 3 years combined export levels was just seen import levels was seen in 5 months. Where is it coming from? Instead of coming from China, it was coming from Thailand and Mexico. So what really happened was trade flow rerouting. So how effectively can a country really prevent trade from going from one country to another? It could only prevent the direct route. So I think the quantity risk is very difficult to implement by any country, including China. And the classic case of 2010, like we were talking about this, what really happened was it couldn't restrict supply only to Japan. The entire world was affected by this in terms of high prices. So there is really no evidence during that period to show that there was any selective cut in supply exclusively to Japan. And in terms of lithium, when we look at this period from 2013 to 2020, you can see China, rest of the world, how the production compares. And we're also looking at the price of battery-grade lithium carbonate during this period. So when you see 2013 to 15, the prices were relatively stable. But then the prices started going up 2015 to 17. During that time, China continued to increase capacity and production. If China wanted to restrict supply and increase prices, they could have reduced production, which did not happen. So this is a potential argument that you could say that there are periods in history when China could have reduced output and increase production, and increase the prices, but it hasn't happened. But does that mean that they cannot do it? But they very well can, given that they do have dominant production. And if you go further, across time, whatever happens, whether prices go up or down, China continues to increase production and capacity, so much so that they're building capacity and increasing capacity at the same time reducing capacity utilization. Like, this is not something we see in a free market economy. If you are in a free market economy, you are liable to recover your capital costs. China doesn't seem to care about that. And that industrial policy approach, which we've been hearing about in a lot of other talks too, China producing for the entire world almost is something we're seeing as a feature here too. So some evidence suggests that China did not exercise market power when it could have. The example I was telling you just now about the 2015 to 18 surge in prices, they could have if they had wanted to, but the supply continued to increase. Similar patterns have been observed in cobalt during the 2006 and 2008 period, 16 to 18 period as well. So whether prices increase or decrease, China has continued to increase capacity and production. That's kind of the common theme that we're seeing. What is the plausible alternative explanation to this? Well, the way we call it, OPEC used to be accused of being called the clumsy cartel. So China may be called the clumsy catalyzer for expansion and capacity. For example, China's increase in processed lithium capacity outpaced global use by over 150,000 tons in 2017. And expanding EV production was a priority for China at the national level. They implemented industrial policies to make sure the supply chains were secure. And how they implemented it ended up being so the capacity went, it basically overshot capacity. And the other thing is use of surplus production processing capacity reduces the price of these minerals, but not necessarily there was deliberate entry deterrence. That is also something we have seen. China has utilized less and less of its capacity to process lithium, so the evidence for that is the capacity utilization falling from 60% in 2013 to around 40% in 2020. So this is not something that's unique only to these, critical minerals that's like lithium or, small volume minerals that we're looking at. This is something that China has encountered even in the past, even with, steel and aluminum. I'm just showing you the graph for steel here. So what we see here is 1990 to 2014, and we're talking in terms of million tons on the left, on the y-axis. You can see the massive growth in steel production and capacity here, and that's accompanied by massive imports of raw materials. So basically, the entire world is mining and supplying to China, and China is processing for the entire world. So that's basically what was seen in the steel case, and this repeats in the aluminum case, and we're kind of seeing that now in lithium, cobalt, and other critical raw materials. So given that this is what is happening, what do we think are the implications for public policy, given the kind of risks we could have? Like I talked about the quantity risk, the 3 kinds of price risk that China could implement, and how effectively it could implement. It may not be able to effectively implement all kinds of these, exercise market power in all ways, but in some cases it might be able to be successful. So as far as public policy goes, the US, the rest of the world, or whichever country that cares about the reliable supply of these minerals needs to think about, we need to think about strategies to have policy that can encounter these risks. So what I think is that we should focus, the policy should basically focus more on the risk of high prices than physical availability, because it's still going to be available. It's not in the best interests for China to restrict supply forever, because that automatically leads to other countries setting up capacity. So, which is what exactly happened now. They introduced export restrictions for rare earths, and then now we're having negotiations, and then they're like, okay, we're going to export again. Well, it does have major implications for defense applications, not so much for consumer applications, but it's going to go in cycles if we just let this go as it is. So what we could think about is press for greater transparency in pricing of bilateral contracts. This could prevent the price risk of price discrimination I was talking about, different prices for domestic consumers in China versus the rest of the world. The ultimate remedy, in my opinion, is diversification to increase competition from non-Chinese sources. And for this, like Fabian was talking about earlier, I don't think the US can go it alone, given our resource endowments and the investment levels and free market economies and environmental regulations that we need to adhere to. So we need to come up with really good strategies that don't just handle, temporary, immediate concerns, but think long term. And of course, like I was saying, onshoring, friendshoring, we need to weigh the trade-offs between cost of investment and potential benefits of reduced Chinese market power. Like I was talking about largely lithium and cobalt, but the picture is not very similar for every critical mineral, so I just wanted to bring the rare earths case forward here. The dominance that China has in rare earths is even more excessive than in the minerals like lithium and cobalt, so especially for heavy rare earths. The current deal between MP Materials and DoD is, I think, trying to address some of these, but a lot more needs to be done for a successful implementation of something like a price floor in that agreement. Thank you for listening.